day died and came back to life? Is he really risen from the dead, as the Bible says? Is he really the Son of God, as he claimed to be? Or was he a fraud, a liar, and a lunatic, as his opponents claimed he was? The Bible reports that Jesus was born 2,000 years ago in the Middle East, in Bethlehem, a small and insignificant village. Today, mainly Muslims live here. Christians are a minority. Churches here remind us of the man whose name is known around the world. "100 miles further north is a small village called Nazareth. It was such an insignificant place that people made jokes about it. Jesus lived here with his family. Jesus grew up in the Jewish tradition. He learned all about the Old Testament and the Jewish writings. As an adult, he became a rabbi. He heals many people of their illnesses and teaches them to understand the will of God. He also claims he is the Son of God. He is loved by the common people. Yet the Jewish establishment considers him to be a blasphemer, and the Romans a troublemaker. The political system gets out of hand. The rulers want to get rid of him. His disciples abandon Jesus. The Roman procurator, Pilate, condemns him to die on a cross. Is it possible to find out whether this story is true? Is there any evidence to confirm that it really happened?
We didn't have a camera, we didn't have a microphone there.
Our sources for ancient history are not like our modern sources, where we can record everything on the spot.
You cannot repeat history to test the experiment.
It's not the kind of material that you put in a lab and dissect and look at under a microscope.
But what kind of evidence is there to prove that the story is true? Eyewitnesses report that they found the tomb empty on the third day. But can we trust their testimony? Is it true that Jesus died in Jerusalem and rose from the dead, as the authors of the documents maintain? Or did the disciples create a myth in order to keep the movement going? How can we find answers to these questions? As with many complex scientific questions, there are different approaches to finding an answer. We'll let some experts give their insights into this issue. We'll also visit Nazareth village in the north of Israel with an open-air museum where they built houses in the same way as they did 2,000 years ago, and a model of a garden tomb. Here we'll reconstruct some of the events of Jesus' life, which will help us to understand what happened then. The first question which should be asked is it possible to examine an event that happened 2,000 years ago with modern-day methods?
History can be researched, but it's a different kind of research. History looks for pieces of evidence that can be used as anchor points, that have different kinds of verifiability.
Whenever we deal with things that happened in the past, We're dealing with different kind of evidence. We're dealing with records that we have from the past of what people said they saw and what they experienced.
Wenn wir wirklich rausfinden wollen, was gewesen ist,
If we want to find out what really happened, we have to start with the sources that talk about it. Who wrote something about it? When did he write it? How trustworthy are these sources?
Important documents among the sources containing reports on Jesus are the Gospels, in English, Good News, written by 4 authors who either knew eyewitnesses or were eyewitnesses themselves. Luke, a physician, was one of them.
Lukas zum Beispiel schreibt am Anfang seines Evangeliums.
Luke, for instance, starts his gospel, his report on Jesus' life, by declaring, I have purposed to examine meticulously what and how it happened then.
Und benutzt hier ein Wort,
And he uses the Greek word, akribos, painstakingly.
ich habe die Augen
He goes on, I have interviewed the eyewitnesses and verified it, and then I wrote it down in a good order.
aufgeschrieben.
Another author is John. He claims in his report that he accompanied Jesus and was an eyewitness to Jesus' actions and his teaching.
The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not claim to be written by eyewitnesses of the resurrection. They claim to be recording for us the testimony of people who were there. The Gospel of John claims to be written by an eyewitness of the resurrection.
John writes in his report that he saw Jesus die on the cross.
This man stood at the foot of the cross. This man went into the courtyard of the high priest together with Peter. This man was at the tomb of Jesus. And within the gospel itself, this person provides the testimony to Jesus.
But how reliable and trustworthy are these authors? What are the criteria for an historical document to be considered accurate? For scientific research, it is important that more than one reliable source bear witness to the event. How well is the life of Jesus documented? Are there any other historians who wrote about the life of Jesus besides the biblical witnesses?
In the case of the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, we're quite fortunate because we have multiple sources that talk about his resurrection, not a single source. We have 4 Gospels, and we have external writings from historians like Josephus. And he talks about John the Baptist, he talks about Jesus, and he talks about James, the brother of Jesus.
Im Neuen Testament
In the New
begegnen uns
Testament, we meet many people,
sowohl Freunde von
friends of Jesus as well as opponents, political figures as well as those who were around Jesus. Among the prominent political figures is Pontius Pilate. It is very interesting that we read about him not only in the New Testament, but also in Roman sources. They say the same things the Bible reports, namely that he was the governor, the procurator of the province of Judea from 26 to 36 AD. It is the time when Jesus Christ was tried by him and crucified.
verurteilt worden und ans Kreuz geliefert worden.
Another criteria that lends credibility to an historical document is archaeological evidence. In Caesarea, a Mediterranean seaport, archaeologists found an inscription with the name Pontius Pilate. Many objects from the times of Jesus have been preserved here and bear witness of the Roman occupation force and the Jewish world of 2,000 years ago.
We have points of archaeology, or we have outside testimony from farther afield that help us know that this in fact happened, or this person in fact was there. 20 years ago, the tomb of Caiaphas was found. He becomes something of a fixed record.
There is no information more detailed and contemporary about any other event in antiquity than about the life of Jesus.
Another criteria that makes an historical manuscript true is how connected the authors were to the actual events, and how much time elapsed from when the actual events occurred to when the authors wrote about them.
The texts of the Gospels are so trustworthy because the authors had immediate connections to the events, either in person or by interviewing eyewitnesses. The texts were also written only a few years, or at the most a few decades after they happened. That's a much better situation compared to other ancient authors that are used as sources concerning historical events in the ancient world.
Die man auch sonst zur Grundlage nimmt über historische Ereignisse der Antike.
Ich persönlich glaube,
I personally believe that the writers of the Gospels are very trustworthy witnesses, because they tell very precisely what happened, and interestingly, they also report many minute details that are not glorious, miraculous, or glossed over, but very ordinary, even failures. For instance, of followers of Jesus who get deceived, lie, and betray. Such details wouldn't be reported by someone who just wanted to write down a nice legend or a beautiful report glossing over the facts. We can see that these sources took pains to give a very detailed report of the actual events.
Ereignisse sehr genau wiederzugeben.
But how big is the time difference between what happened and the time when it was written down? Didn't many stories around Jesus' life fall into oblivion?
Wir haben also insgesamt einen
In our case, just 20, 30, or at the most 40 years have passed. Let's take an example of our times. We either have already lived 20, 30, or 40 years ago, or know people who were alive then. And if we'd say there was no J.F. Kennedy, or he was not assassinated, there would be lots of people who'd say, but I saw it on TV. I witnessed it. It's like that with the Gospels. The first biographies about Alexander the Great were written 400 years after his death. The Alexander myths and the legends originated even later. So you have to acknowledge that the distance to the original events of the New Testament is extremely favorable. It is even more favorable than with, for example, Tacitus. Tacitus is a major Roman historian who wrote about the 1st century in the beginning of the 2nd century and mentioned Jesus Christ. But his text was written several decades further away from the events than the texts of the New Testament.
There are New Testament manuscripts dating from as early as the beginning of the 2nd century and going on after that to as many as 5,000. That in itself makes it easier to determine what was the actual text, and that in turn is important in determining whether something is reliable or not.
But how is it possible that the sayings of Jesus were not forgotten? How were they preserved and passed on to the next generation?
In the time of Yeshua, a rabbi's words were memorized by his disciples, who had learned all of their learning as they grew up. It was all by memorization. That was the educational system, and they had tremendous memories, and they could store away tremendous amount of oral teaching that they had learned from their sage.
Oral tradition is something that was part of the 1st century Jewish culture that we don't really know about today. A rabbi would sit down with his disciples, and there would be certain things that he would repeat, and that he would expect his disciples to repeat and to remember. This was part of something that the church in Jerusalem had access to. Eyewitnesses, followers of Jesus, who had spent 3 to 4 years listening to their rabbi, memorizing some of his teachings, passing these on as a collection.
But how did the first writings about the life of Jesus, the Gospels, come about?
As time is going on and that first generation of apostles and witnesses is beginning to die, it becomes necessary to put down in writing for subsequent generations what they have witnessed. And that is what the Gospels do. They take the testimony of the eyewitnesses and they shape it in a community of faith for the generations to come.
I tell you who hear me, Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you.
Now, what was this Jesus like, who was revealed through these eyewitness accounts? Was he trustworthy, authentic? Did he practice what he preached? Or did he seduce people, as the political elite of his day maintained?
Was war es, das Jesus so attraktiv machte?
What made Jesus so popular? While reading the New Testament, we meet an extraordinary personality, displaying great clarity and an immense love and affection.
In einer ganz großen Zuwendung, einer ganz großen Liebe.
He spoke in the synagogue in Capernaum. He spoke in people's homes. And the excitement with what he was saying and what he was doing was so great that eventually he was speaking to thousands on hillsides. And they were even following him from town to town in order to be close to him and listen to him and watch what he was doing.
There were miracles in his ministry. People were coming to Jesus to be healed. He was not simply a teacher. He was more like what we know of the Hasidim, these people a little bit off-center from the main culture, people attracted for what this person can do. He can pray and God will listen to him and answer his prayers. And that will bring crowds from all over.
The eyewitnesses tell us that Jesus was a popular rabbi, a teacher, and that he traveled through the country with a group of men, just like other rabbis did.
Who do the crowd say I am?
Some say that you are John the Baptist. Others say that you are Elijah, while others say that one of the prophets of long ago has come back to life.
What about you? Who do you say I am?
Jesus was respected by the other rabbis. They would come and debate with him every day, and they would argue and discuss scriptures. And some of the terminology that Jesus has used, for example, hypocrites, when he called the Pharisees hypocrites, was a very common expression among Pharisees themselves. And Jesus would discuss with them and argue with them. In fact, the rabbis say that their best disciples are the ones that argue and debate.
Tell us, what right do you have to say these things? Who gave you such right?
Now let me ask you a question.
That is something amazing, that a carpenter from Nazareth can have had some fishermen and a tax collector and a Jewish nationalist zealot. And those 11 men can tell a story without armies, without secret police, without coercion, that has such a power in it to affect people's lives.
What gained him so many followers was not only Jesus' compassion and his ability to heal the sick, but that he claimed to be their Messiah, the Son of God, and this stirred up the opposition.
Are you then the Son of God?
You say that I am.
His claim to be the Son of God was strongly rejected by his enemies. Who were they, and why did they fear his influence?
We know from the records of Josephus that one family was in the priesthood, and they were literally in collusion with Rome. They paid Rome in order to be priests. They were from an aristocratic family. They were totally corrupt. They liked their positions of power. They were not really trusted by the general Jewish people.
The temple, you have to understand, was probably the biggest money-making business in the whole land. The people who controlled the temple were wealthy beyond dreams. These were the high priestly families, and they became famous in Christian tradition, but they also became famous in Jewish tradition as unimaginably corrupt. The authorities were like a mafia. The Jewish tradition says they were corrupt. Josephus, Jewish writing in Greek, says they were corrupt. The Christian tradition says they were corrupt. It means they were probably corrupt.
The New Testament describes Jesus as a teacher who criticizes the establishment. The Roman and Jewish rulers saw him as a threat and wanted to get rid of him for different reasons.
The impact of his words and his behavior was such that the Jewish leaders got scared. Now, I know that there's a tendency in Christian history to think the Jews were against Jesus. That's totally false. The Jewish people loved Jesus so much that their leaders, who were jealous of him, were scared to take him in the daytime. They took him in the middle of the night when he was all alone praying out among some olive trees, on a hillside outside Jerusalem.
Pilate, the Roman governor, was also described as a corrupt politician. He was responsible for law and order in Jerusalem. No easy task, because many Jews rebelled against the Roman occupation.
We caught this man perverting our people. He caused an uproar in the temple market. What will be his punishment? Sentence him. I see no reason to condemn this man. No reason. We found him guilty.
This was a corrupt group of leaders who wanted the extermination of Jesus.
When you read at Jesus' trial that the Jews are shouting, "Crucify him," it's, I would practically say, a gang of associates of the high priests that are trying to make Jesus look dangerous in the eyes of the Roman authorities so that he will be gotten rid of.
If you think about it, it's not difficult to see how that could have happened. We see it today when crowds of people are around. You've only got to infiltrate a few, maybe 8 or 9, to shout and become activists, and the rest of the people either don't know what's going on or they'll just follow suit.
According to biblical and non-biblical reports, Pilate condemned Jesus. He is nailed by the Roman soldiers to a cross. Jesus dies, and Joseph of Arimathea places him in his family tomb. The eyewitnesses say that they found the tomb empty when they visited it 3 days later, and they further report that they met Jesus in person a short time later. These events are described in retrospect by the authors, but with different emphases in each of their accounts. The author Matthew writes that 4 soldiers guarded the tomb and that an angel met Mary Magdalene. That makes a total of 6 people at the scene. Mark talks of Mary, 2 women, and an angelic being. That makes a total of 4 people. Luke talks of Mary, 2 angels, and several women, and that Peter joins them later. 6 people. But in John's account, there is a total of 5 persons who meet at the tomb. How credible are these sources, who each describe the events surrounding the death and resurrection of Jesus in such different ways?
If there are a number of, a variety of records from different people that could be giving evidences of a same event or the existence of some specific person by different sources, so that there's some kind of a cumulative evidence. If you had only one person speaking or writing, there would be more reason to question whether we can trust it or not.
The excitement itself will have caused people to remember different things, see things differently, put emphasis in different places. And so the differences that there are, I would say, are certainly within tolerance levels. In other words, they're the kinds of things we would expect if 4 different people record a very significant event to the 4 of them.
The fact that someone didn't come along afterwards and give us one unified account, so there wouldn't be any differences between the manuscripts, is very helpful for us. It helps to confirm that we don't have a harmonization or a wiping out of anything that contradicts this or that.
If all the reports were completely uniform, you might believe that someone harmonized them, and then you would be extremely skeptical. And I think historians take it for a positive sign when there are differences in the assessment of historical facts. The existence of differing traditions, different witnesses and reports gives the event a greater credibility than if you have reports of different people who witnessed the same event and whose reports are fully identical.
The accounts that we have are based on the recollections of people who were there, not written at the time. So there are variations. But even if you were to take, for example, an automobile accident, and you had 4 people, one on each corner, watching an automobile accident that happens, they're not expecting it to happen. And then after the fact, you take their testimonies, there are going to be differences based on position, on attention, on what angle they saw things from, in their own telling of something that all of them witnessed simultaneously. So of course there's a variety of expression, a variety of testimony based on each person's individual experience.
We have multiple meetings of the resurrected Jesus with different eyewitnesses in different circumstances, and all of this gives us a composite picture of veracity that otherwise isn't known for any other miraculous kind of experience. A lot of historians say if it's miraculous, we don't want it at all. We just exclude it. But if you don't take that approach, if you say, no, let's look for consistency, then what we have with the resurrection is a very remarkable, unrehearsed or unfabricated testimony of 4 people that fit together in very complex ways that, when it's all done, has the ring of authenticity, of veracity, of truth.
Even though there are different perceptions, is there any common ground in these reports? All 4 authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, testify in common the following aspects. Jesus died in Jerusalem and is seen there again shortly after. Concerning the place of these events, there is no divergence in the reporting. This city is still in existence today. It is a gold mine for evidence concerning the life of Jesus. Pilate is mentioned in all the writings. He interrogates Jesus, condemns him, and confirms his death. Also Caiaphas, the high priest and head of the high council, is mentioned unanimously in the texts. He demanded the execution of Jesus. Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for permission to bury Jesus according to Jewish custom. The corpse was wrapped up in a linen sheet and laid to rest in Joseph's family tomb. All 4 authors report that Mary Magdalene was the first person to arrive at the tomb early in the morning of the 3rd day, and Mary is unanimously mentioned as the first person Jesus met after his resurrection.
We see that the reports are based on the testimony of women, Mary Magdalene and the women being the first witnesses at the empty tomb. This in itself is a remarkable feature of the Gospels and a point that shows their honesty in the fact that they did not resort to changing the story and making men be the first witnesses. We realize that in Judaism, women were not allowed in that day to be witnesses in a court. They were considered untrustworthy and somewhat hysterical and emotional. The fact that the Christian church would preserve the authenticity of the report of the women is a point in its favor in terms of telling the truth of the gospel.
2,000 years ago, women are not your good witnesses. They're not the mainstay of the community and in a court system, let's say. So women give it high veracity, and there's confusion, and that has high veracity, because if you first go to a tomb and find it empty, you don't know what happened. And the confusion that would come from that, I think, is reflected in having 4 gospel accounts, all taking different pieces together and preserving some of that quality of confusion at the beginning.
All the authors and eyewitnesses agree on one issue. The tomb was empty. Only the empty linen wrapping remained. But where was Jesus? What happened after his crucifixion and burial? This question has been answered in different ways. A variety of theories have surfaced about what might have happened. Maybe Jesus hadn't really died, or his corpse was stolen by his disciples. Did the disciples go to the wrong tomb, or did they have hallucinations? Or did they create a legend in order to maintain their faith in Jesus? What really happened? What kind of evidence is there for the death and resurrection of Jesus?
Jesus wird verhaftet, geht unter Bewachung.
Jesus is arrested. He is escorted to the cross by a guard. That is well documented. Roman soldiers guard the cross. His death, too, is expressly verified. And before he is taken from the cross, there is the order to make sure that he is really dead. It is described how a Roman soldier thrust his lance into his side, and, so goes the report, blood and water came up. Obviously, I am no medical doctor. The process of blood coagulation had progressed so far that they could say, this man is really dead. So Jesus was really dead.
Pilate specifically sent, when they asked for Jesus' body so that they could bury him before the holiday started and the Sabbath, Pilate sent, and he's had someone confirm that Jesus was actually dead.
If you examine the documents carefully, you'll see there's not one statement that denies that Jesus really died. But couldn't it be that Jesus was just seemingly dead? What do the experts say?
First, the Romans knew when a person was dead. Second, the Roman soldiers were responsible to see to it that the crucified man was really dead. Otherwise, they had to pay with their own lives. Third, we are told that Jesus was laid into a new tomb in the rock, closed by a huge rolled stone. Even if he had only been seemingly dead and woke up, he was so weak. Remember, he had been scourged, had lost a large amount of blood, that it is unthinkable that he would have been able to roll the stone away from inside.
Not only do the Gospels and the epistles, of course, talk about his death, but even non-Christian historians say that he was put to death under Pontius Pilate, and they have no special axe to grind, they have no special agenda. They're just telling us the simple historical fact that Pilate put to death Jesus of Nazareth. So there's not really a remote chance that Jesus survived the cross. He did die.
He didn't come to his disciples and say, oh, that was close. You know, they almost got me, but I woke up in the tomb, and the Lord has given me more years for my ministry. No. You know, we have Jesus coming to his disciples saying, I was dead and I'm alive.
How do you want to explain that a man who had been hanging on a cross for hours, who had lost a lot of blood, who was taken from the cross and who had survived this ordeal, what might have happened very rarely,
It's 8
yet that
o'clock.
such a man is acclaimed by his followers as the King of Life, the victor over death. He certainly did not look like that.
Would he have been walking around wounded, hardly able to walk? This wasn't the image, this wasn't the risen Lord that was witnessed by the disciples and by the 500 eyewitnesses. This was a man that was radiant, that was strong, that inspired them to go out and preach that he was risen, even against the authorities of Rome, knowing that they would be put to death. This wouldn't have been a wounded, broken, dying man.
The authors of the Gospels state that Jesus was dead and laid in a private garden tomb shortly before the feast of Passover began. What happened then? Early on the third day, the women who followed Jesus came to the tomb. The stone was rolled away. The tomb was empty. Where was the body of Jesus? Could it be that the disciples were able to steal him out of the tomb? How believable is the theory that the Roman soldiers had fallen asleep while the disciples stole the body?
Roman soldiers who fall asleep on their guard anywhere were actually severely punished and oftentimes put to death. They knew that that would be there looming if in fact they did fall asleep.
The soldiers recognized that he wasn't there. They went and reported to their superiors in fear for their lives that they had somehow dropped the ball, and their superiors said, "Don't worry, we will cover it, nothing will happen to you, and we will report as a way of explaining this that the disciples came while you were asleep and stole the body away." I think if I was one of those soldiers, I would have said, "Can't we come up with a little better story than this? Sleeping on duty is not something that gets a soldier rewards. He can get in big trouble." But we're not told what happened to those soldiers afterwards. But this was the first attempt at explaining what happened, that the tomb is empty, that Jesus is not there. And they invented this idea that the disciples had stolen the body away.
Also offensichtlich kam es vor.
Apparently it happened that corpses were stolen. There is a famous inscription from Nazareth saying that it is forbidden to steal corpses from the tombs. We don't know if this has anything to do with Jesus of Nazareth, but apparently it was a problem, and the New Testament writings refer to this. That's why guards were placed in front of the tomb, and the suspicion is expressly uttered. Or they might steal the body and say afterwards that he is risen from the dead. This was suspected right from the beginning, and that's why they took measures to prevent it.
Imagine the disciples, a group of frightened men who'd run away actually, and were in hiding, who would suddenly become brave enough to overcome the Roman guards, to move the stone, to remove the body and hide it, is inconceivable.
If I were living in the first generation and I had followed a religious teacher who I really admired and he died, I don't think that I would just want to be part of a movement that would steal the body and say he rose from the dead. What reward would there be in that? What would be the benefit of such a fraud? There's no financial gain there. There's no, what would be the logic? It's just absurd to think that you would perpetrate that type of a hoax and then die for it.
The Sea of Galilee today. On these shores, Jesus and his disciples lived in close fellowship. Here, Jesus performed many miracles, talked with his disciples about his death, his resurrection, and his coming again. Could it be that their experiences with Jesus were so intense that they wished him back to the point of hallucinating the events of his resurrection.
The idea of a hallucination of this type, where it would be first being seen by 12, then in some women, and then being seen again up in the Galilee, then being seen again on the Mount of Olives as he's about to ascend into heaven, where it isn't just a dozen, but it is a mass of people who actually had witnessed the risen Lord. It can't be just a single hallucination that took place that invented this whole story.
These people did not behave in the way that doctors would describe someone who's hallucinating. They behaved in a very human way. First of all, they showed how they were grief-stricken, shocked, traumatized, full of remorse. They hadn't expected Jesus to be taken in the middle of the night and crucified. Then, when they saw him, they were totally changed. But still, some of them were unbelieving and doubtful and skeptical, and their stories differed. Their reactions differed. They did not behave like people that were hallucinating. They behaved like ordinary human beings, you and me, who were trying to make sense of all the amazing things that were going on.
The New Testament tells about Thomas, a disciple of Jesus. He was a skeptic and doubted that Jesus had really risen from the dead.
Now, when Jesus did appear to the disciples after he rose, there was actually one of the disciples missing. This was Thomas. We have the expression in English, at least, doubting Thomas, someone who is not ready to accept everything that he hears and is doubtful that it's really true. And he got this name because when they told him that Jesus was alive, Thomas, rather than being hallucinated and saying, "Oh, fantastic, I knew that was going to happen," said, "No, I don't believe it. Unless I see him myself and I can touch him physically, I'm not going to believe that he was alive." And so then a week later, Jesus comes, appears to them again. Thomas is there this time, and he says, "Okay, here I am, touch me and see." And at that point, Thomas does believe. Again, I think that this weakens the idea that there was some kind of mass hallucination.
In that period following the death of Yeshua, they actually studied with him for approximately 40 days. They ate with him, they lived with him, they studied with him, just like before. He was preparing them for the persecution they were going to face afterwards.
How many instances do we have in history of a whole group of people having the same hallucination at the same time, and they're ready to give their lives for the truth of it?
Another author of the New Testament became a follower only after Jesus' death. Paul. He himself was not an eyewitness to the events surrounding the death and resurrection of Jesus.
Paulus ist für uns deswegen ein interessanter Charakter.
Paul is such an interesting personality for us because he did not belong to the group of disciples when Jesus died and rose again. He writes about himself that he is an educated Pharisee, that he studied in the school of Rabbi Gamaliel, a famous teacher of that time, that he persecuted the church during the first years after Jesus' death. He was an opponent of the Jesus movement.
The New Testament describes how Paul traveled from Jerusalem to Damascus, armed with letters from the high priest, ordering the arrest of those Jews who believed in Jesus. But on his way there, he had a life-changing encounter.
He had persecuted the church, but then he reports that he himself met the risen Jesus. After that, he started his quest and began to inquire what this resurrection was about, searching new facts. He explains in a letter why he now knows that Jesus is risen. Jesus is risen according to Scripture, and he has been seen by different people. Then he tells their names and goes on, up to 500 people have seen him. Paul didn't sit down and say, I want to write down a plea for the resurrection. No, he wrote a very personal letter to the people in the city of Corinth. And in it, he says that there are 500 eyewitnesses of the resurrection of Jesus, and that some of them are still alive. Of course, that tells us a lot about the facts. Paul would have been stupid if he had maintained the resurrection and it were not true. The Corinthians might have asked the eyewitnesses who were still alive and might have found out that it was not true at all.
Denn die Korinther hätten ja diese lebenden Augenzeugen dann fragen können und hätten herausgefunden, es war gar nicht so.
Throughout the history of humanity, there have been heroes who were venerated and who were objects of myths and legends.
In the generations that follow, things can be elaborated on in any story. The mythology follows on after many generations after being out of contact with the real story. What's important here is that what we have are eyewitness accounts of what took place. Because it isn't just any myth. It's a real story that took place in real history.
It was a physical event, but it's a physical event with very, very large spiritual meaning for those who accept it. Christianity is a historical religion. If it's not a historical religion, it's nothing.
In the gospel texts, the followers of Jesus talk about the resurrection of Jesus in a very individual way. You can sense their dismay at his death, but after his resurrection, they seem to have an unshakable hope.
Whether we believe these people or not has to come from another source than my knowing them and how reliable they are because I have met them and I know what kind of people they are. It has to come from what kind of an impact it had on their lives. And that is something amazing.
After the death of Yeshua, it's remarkable that a few days later, they are willing to risk their lives. They're willing to speak before kings and potentates and risk getting their heads cut off or crucified. Something happened, and I don't think anything but a resurrection, I don't think anything but Yeshua coming back to life could have so dramatically changed their courage.
The impact of the resurrection on the disciples was dramatic.
They were ready to go in the face of the Roman Empire, which says there's a multitude of deities. They were ready to be thrown into amphitheaters to fight wild animals. Or they were thrown into amphitheaters to fight one another. People gave their lives for this. And not only that, their lifestyle changed because of what they believed about Jesus. Now try and pass that all off on some kind of a bad dream that they had.
The traumatized and disoriented disciples were suddenly changed into courageous and extremely convincing personalities.
In Judaism, you had to come up with 2 witnesses. He had 12. He had more witnesses. 12 witnesses, 24 witnesses. How many witnesses do you need to the risen Lord before you accept the fact that these people who went on to die for what they saw were committed enough this time around not to deny that they knew him anymore, but were so overwhelmed by this fact that of his resurrection that they said he did die and he did rise from the dead as he said he would.
This encounter with the living Jesus made a huge difference to his followers and gave them a hope far beyond death.
In the end, it doesn't matter how much scientific work you do. People, if they want to believe something, people will believe it. People who don't want to believe something, they won't believe it. But in the end, those of us who also want to see the sense behind it, if we really pursue it and all the facts that lie in line with the historical story of Jesus and his life, his death and resurrection, it has come to the satisfaction of almost all scholars today that something did in fact happen there.
If that really happened, if Jesus really rose from the dead, we ought to see everything he said before his death about himself in a new light, because now it is, so to speak, confirmed by a higher institution.
It happened 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem. Jesus Christ died on the cross according to the eyewitnesses. The memory of his death and his nameless grave would have fallen into oblivion. But after his death, something extraordinary happened, something that caused a deep change in some people's lives. They said they met Jesus after his death. Could it really be that this unbelievable thing happened? That this Jesus rose from the dead? There is evidence that he did. Isn't it possible, then, that there is a dimension that goes beyond our mortal lives? Because of his resurrection, Jesus would be the first person to prove this.
This first resurrected person telling us about what God's purposes are, he then gives us a promise that this is going to be played out in a totally different dimension in the future.
Because we know now that death doesn't have the final word, we can look at life from a new perspective, which goes beyond death.
The great triumph, the great climax of history will be his second coming.
When we are convinced that Jesus was raised from the dead, then this means that the fact about his coming back is also real.
The resurrection is actually seen in the New Testament as a guarantee of Jesus' return and what is very significant, of the resurrection of those who believe in him.